Friends, welcome to the Pints with Jack video sessions, where each week David and I dive into a specific topic that we discuss on the podcast. And so first, if you don't subscribe, go subscribe to the podcast. But today, we are going to be talking about the topic of woundedness, and more particularly, the impact it can have on our lives, our spiritual journeys, and then more importantly, what we can learn from them and how we can heal them. And so to set some context here, for those that are listening to the podcast, this came out because in this recent episode that we released this week, we're going through Till We Have Faces, and Orwell and Psyche are these two main characters, and they're sisters. And Psyche is really this honestly perfect, virtuous person. And there's this moment.
And you've got a lot of experience with that, Matt, because you do this podcast with me.
That's exactly right. So I'm the broken one. David is the perfect one. And Psyche goes out. Clearly, David's the humble one. So Psyche goes out, comes back, and for various reasons, Orwell gets incredibly angry. And Psyche, Orwell's sister, says to her, "There, don't be angry. You just look like our father when you say those things." And Orwell responds, or thinks, I guess, "Though the words 'you look just like our father' and 'from her' had hurt me with a wound that sometimes aches still, I let go my anger and yielded." So she said it hurt her, this wound that aches still. And we learned that her father is a terrible human being. And so essentially Psyche is here comparing her to her father. Like, could you imagine having a father that bad and someone saying, "You remind me of our father"? It's like, wow, that hurts. And that really affected her. And what we see constantly throughout this book, and as we've been learning, is your woundedness affects your journey towards either your true self or your false self. Like when you're living from a place of woundedness, when you're living from a place of shame, it's amazing how we develop these tendencies, these patterns, these behaviors, call them our false self, that we put on to essentially earn love from the world. It's like, I don't feel like I'm worthy because someone or something has been done to me that makes me feel that way. And therefore I act in a certain way to earn love. And a lot of times those aren't living out of our authentic self, that self that says we are loved. And so I'm curious, David, as you were reading this, like what your experience is, as I even say this, because you don't know any of these things I'm going to bring up, but any thoughts are coming to as I unpack this. I don't want to go through the whole thing without getting your input.
Yeah, I mean, throughout the book, you see wounds delivered by the king to Oriel. Sometimes they are physical when he throws her around and hits her, but repeatedly they are verbal when he calls her goblin daughter and keeps referring to how terribly ugly she is. And, you know, perhaps one day she might be a bit more useful to him. And those kinds of wounds, if they're not dealt with, they're going to impact you further down the line. And I think of the visual reaction for when somebody's cut, or hurt in some way. What do? You immediately want to cover it and protect it.
Yes.
And in the short term, that's a good thing. If you've been cut, it'll stem the flow of blood. It'll allow it to heal somewhat. But it's still, at some point, you have to take your hand away, and you have to let the wound breathe, and sometimes have medicine applied to disinfect that wound. Because if that doesn't happen, it's only going to get worse and fester over time.
What a fantastic analogy, David. I've just got a big smile on my face because that was impressive. And as you were saying that, I was thinking about, because this transitions into the next thing that I want to discuss is how we go about healing these wounds. Because we've already talked about how we cover them up. And in our case, we put this false self on. And that's dangerous, first of all, before we move on to the next part. Because the false self, if you do successfully put on a false self, like let's look at my own life just to make this a bit more practical. My false self is obvious. It's success and accomplishments. Like when I feel down, I turn to success and accomplishments. And then I think that makes me worthy and that makes me loved. The danger, though, is when I do experience love, I can't experience unconditional love because I always assume it's conditional. I am loved because of this, this, and this. And in the spiritual journey, that's very dangerous because It is only when we accept our brokenness in the unconditional love of God that we actually get that transformation. And so I used to approach this from a healing perspective before Lewis and theosis, this concept of divinization. I used to approach it as, all right, I need to just work through this issue. Clearly, this is a problem, and honestly will myself to overcome it or think it. It's like, well, now that I know this is an issue, if I just see it every time and try to squash the false self with my own effort, I will overcome it. And I'm not saying those are bad things, or reading self-help books or going to therapy. I mean, those can be very important with dealing with wounds and shame. But what Lewis absolutely transformed my life with was that idea of divinization, the divine life coming within us and transforming us. And that's Christ coming within us. And as you did the whole analogy, when you open up and breathe, then you get, I thought of like the antibodies coming in and starting to work in the wound on the inside and healing it from inside out. And that's what Christ is doing within us. And for me and for you, I know being Catholic as well, that's where the Eucharist comes in. That's where for me going to daily Mass. That's where for me praying the Rosary daily. That's where for me going to daily adoration. The more time I spent meditating or in the presence of Christ or consuming Christ, the more I just felt these wounds being healed. The more I felt this transformation happening within me. The more I felt that Christ loved me, and I started to receive that unconditional love, and it was amazing what happened.
I think the chief thing that it requires is vulnerability. In the same way that it requires vulnerability for me to remove my hand from the wound and put myself at the mercy of a healer to see to that wound. It's the same thing when we're doing all of those things that you describe. We can do all of those things, but just simply going through the motions and still holding tightly to our wounds. And coming to the sacraments with a spirit of vulnerability and trust that we are going to open ourselves to the wounded healer, Christ on the cross. There's a lovely line in the Byzantine rite of confession where the priest says, "Now that you have come to the divine physician, tell everything so that you may depart healed." That we have to come and allow God to love us and to speak words of truth to us, particularly if we've heard lots of lies from the world. Orwell is repeatedly told how terrible she is by her father. She needs to be able to hear the words of affirmation from someone whose opinion really matters. And he's her father, but ultimately he's not the final standard.
I'm really glad you brought that up too, because I'm actually glad you brought up the word affirmation, because so much of our wounds are honestly negative. Is it called negative affirmation? I don't know what that would be as one word, but you know what I mean. And that is when we go to Christ and we hear, those are lies that Satan tells us, but when we go to Christ and we hear that, no, that's not who you are. You are beloved. You are my child. Yes, you are broken. Of course, you're a sinner, but I still love you, and I've made you good, and I have made you for a purpose. And as it says in Psalm 139, you are fearfully and wonderfully made. You have to keep these things on your mind, because you're countering that negative talk. I never forget, I had a retreat in San Diego. It's a church community, and a guy gave a talk on the negative commentary that Satan puts into our mind, the lies that we tell ourselves. And we have to combat those. And so I think it's very important as a practical tool outside of just the sacraments. What you said is, when you feel those lies coming up, name them. Say, this is not true. In fact, this is the truth of me, and this is who God is. I think that's just so important.
And also, it's not that sometimes bad things said about us aren't true. Sometimes they are actually true. When I go to confession,
no,
I'm
none of them are
sins that I have actually committed.
Yeah.
But the point is that those don't outweigh the measure of grace that God has for me.
Yes, and they don't define you.
Exactly, and they don't define my identity. Pope St. John Paul II had a wonderful line. He says, "We are not the sum of our weaknesses or our failures. We are the sum of the Father's love for us and our real capacity to become the image of his Son, Jesus." That outweighs everything else.
I don't want to add anything more to that. I think that sums up how we heal our woundedness. And I appreciate all of the stuff you added to this, David. I really am enjoying this where you have no idea. I've always trusted when I had this idea to start this YouTube side of things, they just let me roll with it. And I'm already happy we're doing it because I always knew you have enough knowledge that you can just roll with comments that I make and we can turn it into something fun.
I'm happy you're happy.
So, friends, we are so thankful that you watched this. Please, in the comments, let us know if you have any questions and if you have any thoughts or feedbacks as we evolve this new segment of Pints with Jack. And we thank you for joining. Go check out the podcast, rate, subscribe, all that stuff. And we look forward to chatting with you next week where we'll go further up
and further in.
Cheers.
Cheers.